Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Higher Business Series. Today, we're having a conversation about how big ideas actually take hold, spread, and scale in complex systems. I'm Kylie Ingram, the CEO and co-founder of Wiser. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the land of the Bundjalung people and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Today's session is live, so drop us any questions into the LinkedIn comment and we'll try and get to them. And our guest today is strategist and systems thinker Graham Harvey, the author of a new book, The Way of the Living Idea. Graham's work explores how ideas don't just spread with virality, but through resonance, trust, and design networks. His thinking has deeply influenced how we at Wiser approach scaling inside organizations. This episode is for anybody working to move the good work forward. It really does explain to you how to make your ideas and work spread, something that feels really impossible in this noisy world at the moment. Thanks for joining us, Graham. I love this book. The opening is amazing, and you make people feel very seen. It feels like a gift to the reader.
You're most welcome. It's a delight to be here.
That's great. Now, I've got to admit that you are one big math brain, and we have had many conversations together where I have felt maybe a little bit left behind. And so when you gave me the book, I was somewhat scared because I thought this is going to hurt my head. But it was quite the opposite. It was very accessible and written for the exact audience you were looking for. What did that take to get
A
there?
lot of help. It's stuff that I could get very, very, very passionate about, and it's very, very. There's a deep end to the complexity, but the reality is a lot of the principles that come out of that deep end are actually very approachable and very actionable if I could kind of get out of my own way. And so I got both Shannon and also just working with a variety of tools, the LLMs, and just insightful points of view from people who read through it and helped. But yeah, I agree. I think at the end product itself is actually quite approachable and a lot of fun to share with people.
It definitely is. And how did you first get into focusing on how ideas spread?
Well, I'm a bit curiosity led to begin with, and this goes way, 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 way back to the early days before the web was the World Wide Web, when it was just the internet and Gopher space and email. And it used to be that the forward chains of emails would indicate who they sent to who they sent to who they sent. And I started to look at the different content that I had in my inbox, particularly from my aunt who loved to share jokes and such, and began to see that there were, depending on the theme, different thematic rivers. And what triggered it all was I noticed that one broke apart and came back together. And it was really about what content is getting shared here and not shared here. And that is a long, long time ago, and has sort of driven the investigation ever since. But where that evolved or moved to was this realization that we have a lot of context that we use to drive how we actually communicate and what we share and how that moves, and that can be worked with once you sort of understand the patterns of what's going on. So it's been a long journey.
No, and it's fascinating. And your book isn't just a theory, is it? You've launched it by giving 86 people copies in a very strategic way.
Yeah, so the living idea is an expression out of the network theory. So there's a bunch of network algorithms and observations and things that sort of define how that moves. And the living idea is basically a proof concept of those works in and of itself. So the book itself is actually a very strategically designed network intervention meant to do exactly what the book describes on how to do, which is how to stick something into a group of people and have it move authentically and organically through that group of people in a way that self-propels.
How's it going?
It's fun. It's very, very good. I mean, for me, there's a couple of pieces to it. One is that it's surfacing these amazing conversations, and it's been helpful to the people who are joining in as well. I noticed that Shannon came up on the chat, and Shannon actually is the person who helped me edit the work. So shout out there. But in terms of it being put into practical use, even in the early days, it's been really, really neat to see. And for me, a big part of it was being able to surface other people who are interested in this work and bring some help to the people who are doing really meaningful change work.
Nice. And I mean, it really is like I want to drill home up the front before, anybody that is here switches off. It really is a way to make things spread, isn't it? It's a
Yeah.
practical guide, or the start of a practical guide how to make things spread, because I mean, it's just so noisy out there. Like, it almost feels the most impossible time in this world to have your ideas heard, doesn't it? Like, it's just so busy.
Yeah, that's it. And the broadcaster format, whether it's actual broadcast media or whether it's just these pillars of influence on social media and people with huge followings, that whole design is really very shouty, and there's a whole layer of movement of ideas that moves beneath that. That's much more solid and takes hold, and it's how to be able to set up your idea in order to be able to allow it to make that movement through, just as things happen in a real world kind of way.
Yeah, nice. Well, as one of the 86 that were given it, I feel like it's time to share my gift link to make sure anybody watching this today can pick up that copy. But I'll also put it in the LinkedIn after I get off here. Stop full attention to what Graham's saying, but I'll also put it back in at the end. So I love the part where you're kind of saying ideas don't need to go viral, they need to land, echo, and take root. And you talk a lot about trust, emotion, and weak ties as those core ingredients. Do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Sure. So when people start to interact together, as we do very naturally on all sorts of different things, there's different topics that we tend to talk about. So you can sit side by side in a cubicle with somebody for 30 years and never talk about your favorite lasagna, but there's other people that you'll routinely talk about lasagna to. And these kind of dynamics make an effective map that happens in terms of, on any given topic, what the conversation flow happens. And it's not entirely fixed. Part of the living idea is how to reinforce these sort of uh, uh, tenuous ties to be able to strengthen it. But basically, the idea is that you can harness this extra layer of the network of the way that people talk in order to be able to determine where inside a group is the best place to be able to insert an idea. So one of the thought experiments that led to the living idea work was, if you had 10 copies of a book, or 10 invitations to an event, or 10 interactions where you wanted to be able to share an idea, and you had a map of people who would be interested. You knew, and the map will get into how to do the mapping, but if you knew what that looked like, who would you share it to in order to have everybody in the group take hold and absorb it? And that's really the heartbeat of what this is all driving towards.
And I think you mentioned it in the book, and it was one of the first conversations we had was about, if you were launching a book, about finding those, who are those exact whatever people you needed to make it pop, to make it. And it reminded me a little bit of when Malcolm Gladwell wrote The Tipping Point. That bit, what does it take to get it heard? But reading your book is different and probably a lot more practical than that. And who do you need? You kind of talk about, what I really liked was like that bit where you go from one person, and if you know them, so you need weak ties. Tell us a little bit about what weak ties are.
Well, once people start to self-organize, we take on different roles. Everybody knows, and I think I use this example in the book. Everybody knows that if you to stay with our book theme, everybody knows that if Oprah says, "I love this book," your book is on the bestseller list, and away you go. But the dynamic is actually, when you get into it, is that those people are very, very guarded in their thinking. They're very, very guarded in their exposures, because they're stewarding the responsibility of the weight of their own influence on them. And that doesn't apply to Oprah's hairdresser's babysitter, and so we start to see how there are ways of being able to see that in a group there are people who are on the edges of the group who actually take on the responsibility of looking for new things, partly because they're bridging people, and partly just because they're less saturated by the people who think like them in any given circle. And so once you can surface those out, then you can start to be able to share with them information where it gets absorbed into the group in a way that actually feels natural to the group's activity. And this is not necessarily a formal group. This is just how people interact when they interact on given topics. We tend to understand our own nature and relationships by the relationships that we have. But the other piece that's worth noting with the living idea, especially, is the last third of the book is designed for what do you do when you can't see the map? How do you interject something into a community and group in a way that it really takes hold and moves through the group? So that the somewhat macabre example I use is the person who brought COVID to the world didn't know all the relationships that it moved through. They just introduced into it something that is something that has a high R value, something that has a high transmissibility, and then that principle sort of takes hold and moves it through the network. And this is the heart of the living idea intervention specifically. We do talk a lot in the book about the network map and how all of these elements work, but it's actually to be able to create a mapping agent and to create something that is genuinely movable in the way that ideas actually organically, naturally move, but with the weight of such intentionality on top of them.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And when you talk about networks, you also talk about the amplifiers, the bridges, and the popular nodes.
Right. So this, we touched on this a little bit before, but it's actually quite determinable once you sort of begin to see things that there are people who take on these different roles and they have different places, and we tend to focus on the bright spots in the middle of the networks. This is where the influencer culture has sort of emerged, and that mindset. But the reality is there are just as many other critical roles in the way that people interact, where they take on different parts of the whole idea of idea transmission, and those can be worked with.
Yeah. And where do you start with these people? Like, who, if you were going to start out, where do you start?
Well, so part of it is being able to, and I'm going to operate here under the premise of the living idea, which is that you don't have the network map, and sometimes you do. If you have an organization or community that you steward, sometimes it's possible to either directly query them. I know, Kylie, a lot of the work that we've been talking about has been closed groups, which with sort of measurable elements. But in oftentimes, unfortunately, when we're doing change work, we don't always know who's all in our space and who are the most important people to talk to. But the key trick is our people that we do know people who know people who know people who know people, and it's about harnessing them in the process rather than making it sort of casual or accidental, but legitimately calling out and saying, help us find its people and find the people who are most going to be benefited by that. And that's where the living idea really comes in. And the starting point is to be able to say, and you mentioned about the 86 that I chose, this is a real cross section of people. They have very different personalities, some of them, but they're all powerfully interested in making the world a very much better place. And they're also, in the way that they operate and move, present. They would be examples of the group. And I'm seating it widely enough because I know that within that, there will be some who will go, I don't have time to read a book. It'll stay on my shelf till maybe next summer when I can go travel. But there'll be some like yourself in it who go through it and read it and then can help call out to the people for whom this is really important and share it. And so I also built the sharing platform, which is the Gifted Reads platform, the link that you dropped there. I actually had the platform itself built so that the digital rights for sharing all of that can be carried as well. And then they can share that forward, not widely, not like in the sort of grotesque kind of broadcast spam approach, but rather to say either to individuals or to groups, no, this is something I think would be really valuable for you, and hand sort of select and call out to them. And that's really a lot of the dynamics that the book harnesses about that.
And if we go back to that, the ties and the trust, I guess I really like it when you explain that, if say myself and my best friend said to you, hey, we've read this, you should read it. It's got a lot less weight to it than if I say it and somebody that has nothing to do with me. I love that piece. Like,
Yeah, it's one of the favorite parts of the whole process, and one of the favorite discoveries along the way is we have to absorb a lot of information, and we the way we figure out what information to focus on is we attribute weight based on the recommendations. So if I get recommended a book, and I talk about this, I will look at that book depending on what I think of the recommending person, how topical it is to what I'm working on now, how much time I have, all of these different factors. If somebody immediately, their best friend recommends me the book at the same time, I will be more likely to look into it because it's an additional recommendation. But it turns out when you look at the research, it's only slightly, it's only about 20% higher, because what happens is I attribute those two people in my world as connected, and so therefore weight subconsciously that recommendation accordingly. But when those two people don't know each other, then it's actually, it goes to about 110% more likely to do it. So it's just over double as likely to do it as the single recommendation, because now we have two separate people who are now talking about it from different channels. What's really, really interesting and foundational to a lot of the work is that when you hit three unconnected people. So I go home and I talk to my mom, and then I go to work and I talk to my boss, and then I go to the coffee shop and talk to the coffee shop person, none of whom have a relationship with one another. In short order, to me, the whole world is talking about this book. It's not the whole world, it's three people, but it's three people who are getting that attributed weight. And that sort of allows some really interesting movements when you're trying to figure out where to place it, so that the natural decay that happens when we pass along any information, which is from the time that somebody who's really excited about it says it to somebody else, and then they say it to somebody else, there's a sort of slow decay process. When that decay process reverses and it pulls up, it hits another wave from somebody else, and then it gets this re-intensification. And that's where some of the really neat chain reactions can start to happen, and you can start to use Malcolm Gladwell's term, tip a whole group.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And I guess what can happen if you pick the wrong people?
So messages, like any art, have a component that is core, what's written, what's actually there, and they have what we bring into the message by our own journey and experience. And it's less about the wrong people, although it can be. It's more about the wrong timing, the wrong fit, the wrong sort of, because what will happen is people will take, and this happens in messages all the time, is people will take the message, put it in their own context, which is so different and unrecognizable that it no longer creates that echo effect, because it's the person, when they're talking about it, isn't even talking about the same thing anymore. And so the part of the work in the book is how to design a message that has a tight core that's rigid and recognizable, but a loose outside that allows it to become, people can put it into their own world. They can make it meaningful and vernacular, but still familiar. And so that's the piece that has to be sort of managed, is that if it goes in when the timing is off, and I've been the recipient of messages when the timing is off, it's like, not right now, I'm dealing with this, right? And so there's a lot of stuff that can be done in terms of just making sure that the message itself has that sort of fluidity on the outside and a tight bind in the middle that makes it carry successfully.
Let's talk practically. If I know you've got clients that are interested in using, including the way we're using it at Wiser, but what can the research do for somebody practically? If somebody was to say, Graham, come in to my org and help me, what?
That's great. So the first bit is that I think the book itself provides a pretty good map, and it was designed in part because I'm only one guy who's only a certain amount of times, and I've been honored and delighted to work with you and with others like you, but I have to be sort of judicious about my time. So I think there's, for anybody who's got a message and they're just trying to figure out how to get it out, I think there's a groundworking there that's there. I think there's really two big applications of it. One is for somebody who's trying to work with organizational or group or movement intensity, where they're trying to build steam, because it's very, very good at this work is very, very good at being able to help understand the dynamics that make energy flow in a group and flow stronger, be less likely to schism apart. There's a bunch of things that the work can suggest in that. The other is the exact book that the book itself is, which is to insert a living idea, how to design and build and insert that. And I think that in a lot of cases, people are able to just sort of work that. And if certainly they want help with that, it's something that I do as a consultant and as a project partner in a lot of different ways.
Nice. And you also, I really love the bit where you make the case that emotion spreads before content. Like, talk to us a little bit, because trust was all through the book. Trust and emotion.
Absolutely. And it goes back to, you're not going to outshout Coca-Cola, right? There's a Coke logo almost everywhere you look. There's, I saw the Super Bowl ads where Budweiser were beer drinkers at 17 cents a beer drinker. Like the high volume broadcast are just shouting all the time, and they're all shouting all the time. So the way through that is to actually make a genuine connection with a person who is really in the core audience, and then make that transmissible. And so trust is the foundation of that. But trust isn't just a single person attribute, which we do know all the time. I trust this person, I don't really trust that person, that kind of dynamic. But it's also a borrowed and lent element. So and I was really, really tickled by the invitation to come and talk today. But when we get a chance to talk about this, people who know you and don't know me are seeing me through your eyes a little bit. And that dynamic is really key to creating the bridge that allows for the meaningful, deeper exchange than what normally passes on weak ties, which is fairly frivolous fluff elements. And yeah, it's something that trust is not so much a single attribute like this. We think of it as a trustworthy person, but trust is actually a fluid that moves through and it helps shape organizations and networks and groups all the time.
Yeah, nice. Is it right to say we want the idea to feel alive? And what emotional tones do we need in that? Like, is that?
Absolutely. And I mean, emotion is, I'm a philosophy major by training, and I love ideas and finding the exact perfect word and all of these kinds of pieces. And it's part of why writing the book was so challenging, because I'm like, oh, that's eigenvector centrality. That's what it's called. It's like, that's not a helpful word to people when they're trying to understand what it is, right? And but the reality of change conversations is that they have to start with people, with where people are actually at. And that involves this emotional bridge first and the content second. And unfortunately, the hijack marketers have learned this sort of principle for, make people afraid, and then you can get them to do whatever you want, all these kinds of dynamics. But the alternate is also true, that in trust encounters and in places where you're trying to inspire people with ideas or help them see things a different way, the emotional bridge that can be sort of built into your message can actually open the door in a way that then allows the content to be engaged with meaningfully. Sure. So we're talking about emotion and the role emotion has in carrying a message forward. And emotion provides the bridge basis that allows the content to flow. And that's really the heartbeat of what that's about. I'm sure I said it better the first time, but we've got that in recording.
Yeah,
So those of you who are watching the recorded version,
it will record to your system, which is one of the nice things about this system, and then I can edit it. So what about I think we've kind of touched on this, but core connections versus weak ties. Let's kind of drill into that just a little bit more. What so people are clear on what you mean by that.
Sure. So it's important to recognize that everybody does both of these roles, and they're gradient more than they tend to. There tends to be a lot of language around this, and we all sort of pick up the hat and do different things depending on the group that we're at. I may not be core to a particular rock concert I go to. I'm usually the odd person out, but in other relationships, I'm very much at the heartbeat of things, and the work that we've done on Wiser, and these are sort of deeper connections with lots of engagement points and lots of exchange. And both of those relationships have a really powerful role in change. The reality is we don't have a lot of an infinite supply of emotional energy. We don't have an infinite supply of time. And so we tend to curate our connections and contacts based on a curve, on a power law curve that has a bunch of people that we occasionally see, that friend from high school that I see once a year, and then a bunch of people right up to the people that I live with and spend a lot of time with. And those core connections, and that also is a topical nuance too. So my core connections around idea, intellectual things may not include all of my friends who I would otherwise love to spend time with, because they just go, Graham, not again. I don't want to hear it. Right. And so the dynamic and the important part of it is to recognize that they both work in relationship. And so when we insert ideas in our weak ties, those are the big spreaders, but they don't tend to carry the weight so intensely. And then when we have people who are in our core group, that's where the real change work happens. And so there's a movement, and you can govern your messages to be able to work with that. There's a movement that goes back and up and down in that journey, so that people then tend to or people get a result better than if they just tend to focus on the issue without really looking at the larger thing, which is we tend to say power flows downhill, and it doesn't. It actually goes both ways. And the wheat ties is where how new elements and new information gets put in, different perspectives. And obviously, with Wiser, this has been a big part of the journey, is how to be able to make that flow work more smoothly, so that there's a capacity for better information going up and better decisions coming through the process, and the better results from that going back up in an ongoing cycle.
Yeah, nice. And it brings us to that whole thing about margins versus authority. And you kind of argue that, ideas often start at the edges, which is, how we knew Wiser would work when we went to the Sydney Children's Hospital Foundation. They, used to pick the people they knew, it was the same people, whereas we know innovation comes from the margins. And if you're limiting how you're picking things, it goes poorly, doesn't it?
It does, and there's a translation problem, and the way of the living idea is about how do you get over this barrier, that the friction that naturally exists as that comes from these elements, where people tend to surround themselves by who they like, who they know, who they interact with, and then therefore isolate themselves out naturally from the other sources of information. And how do those bridges get rewired when you're working with an organization, so that you can make it a more effective flow? But also, how do you create items that pass through that tough ground into the strong benefit on the other side?
Is there a way for people to, do they just need to be mindful to see the margins, or is there, do you see some people do it better than others, or?
There are two big signals. There's two different scenarios, I guess. One is if you have eyes on a group, and there's lots of organizations and groups where you have eyes on the group. We can do what's called the network pulse map. I talk about it in the book, where you can actually sort of take a snapshot of the group that you have a deep access to, and then you can, from that, I'd say it's all math. Good news is the computers can do the math for you. It can just go, tell me who it is, and it'll give you the list of people. And it's a really neat thing to watch happen. When you don't have that, then the good news is we behave in very predictable ways, and so you can start to watch for signals and tells, and the people who get looked to in certain ways when certain events happen. And there's a set of profiles that again, keeping in mind that we all do these roles all the time, in a given circumstance, you can say, who are the people who are at the edges of this, who are still around but at the edges? Who has one of the types that I talk about is people with a high I get vector centrality, high influence in that, and where they may be people who people turn to in times of question or uncertainty that they wouldn't necessarily always talk to, but when the chips are down, where do their eyes go? Who do they talk to? And there's ways of finding them, and there's certainly ways of finding them when you build something like a living idea, because it leaves ideally a trail behind that then can be followed for other interactions.
Nice. I remember when we first met, you also showing me your, where you had map networks. What do you like? What do you see? What are you looking at when you do that? Because it's a whole lot of what people would imagine, a whole lot of connected dots with.
It is, and the what matters is the relationships between people. Like the dots in these maps, for anyone who hasn't seen one, as people typically, and the lines is the connection or relationship between them. And sometimes those are weighted, and sometimes those are directional. I love Alyssa Milano. She doesn't know who I am. That's a one-directional thing that was set back at Who's the Boss when I was 12 years old. But there's these maps, and what it basically is showing is who connects to who. But what you start to see and there's free software out there that can do this really well, and certainly work with people to help to use it. But you can actually ask it to organize it out and say, who are the clusters? Who are the people that tend to work together? Where are the choke points in a group where all the people have to get their information through this one or two channels? And all of these are also representable mathematically, which means that, and I'm trying to keep the math out of it, but it means that you can print a list and say, list them by the highest one in this order, and get the 10 people who are actually carrying that role for your purpose, for the thing that you're talking about. And they don't always, it's not always intuitive in that way, but once you see it, then it's like, oh, of course that's there, but that's why. And this is what the visualization tools really help people who are not mathematical go, of course it's them and that, and oh, I hadn't thought about that, and what if we connected those two people, then that changes everything. And the good news is just it automatically recalculates.
It's cool, isn't it?
It is.
To give a living example too, in Wiser, when we go into different organizations, it's fine for them to pick up your software, but how do you know how you're going to get the most out of engagement? So using Graham's research to understand who that might be by asking a couple of really simple questions, that's how we start mapping and know who, for a better word, we're calling them super influencers, so that the clients understand what we're talking about, but it really helps them identify who they need to cultivate to pick up the software to, ensure its success and it works, you get the best outcomes rather than it sitting dormant. So that's how it helps us. What are some of the, have you got some other cool, obviously, because that's a cool example. What is
Very cool.
what are some of the other
and just to highlight on that one for a second before, because it's such a cool example, and it's one of the early uses that were used for this is when anytime you have any change coming through a group, like a software adoption, right? Going back to our three recommendations, well, software utilization effectively operates like a recommendation there. So if the people around you are using it, you're more likely to use it. And it can also move into what is the second use that is related, which is there's listening posts. There are people who are key placement in the organization for whom what they will hear will be able to signal and understand what's going on in larger groups and larger dynamics. And so with a very small group, you can listen into what's going on in a way that is not just who's shouting the loudest, which unfortunately in our human interactions is often the case. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, but this is actually the people who are in tune with what's going on or can carry messages back, forward, and out. The other one that I love is just one of my favorite uses is to be able to say, okay, how do we engage with a group, but only have to have real meaningful conversations with a small number in that group to be able to make that conversation carry without it just being ignored, which is not helpful. We're very good at sales conversations, I'll call them one-on-one persuasion conversations of one from another, and we're very good at standing on the highest thing we can do and shouting at everybody, Coke logo style. But this is about being able to discern where that energy can be best put to be able to carry something forward.
And that's important, especially for startups. And, I think you talk about in the book, the people that are trying to make big changes, it's exhausting. And I think part of it is if you don't have a good strategy around how you are going to connect and, do that, this can just save pain. It's a practical way of stopping that burnout and exhaustion by having quite a strategy for how you're going to get your message out there.
And it scales, it saves pain, I think, is the front end experience of that. And I think the back end experience of that is it goes further and stronger than you could ever carry it, no matter how high a hill you can climb on and shout to. Like I talk about in the book, if something triples every day, it's 1 billion at day 20. We just don't experience that. But the ability to have that kind of mechanic occur is something that is available if you build it the right way. And I think that's the other side of the payoff. The short term is that it does, rather than having to talk to everybody to talk to the right person, you can just talk to the right person. And it's an efficiency and pain saver in that way. But then the idea is to actually talk to the right person in a way that they then become an active node in your idea, and they engage with you, challenge it, say that's a really bad idea, and then you explore through it. But when they're done that conversation, assuming the idea holds up, then they become not just broadcasters in the sense of telling it to everybody, but they hand select the people that most need to hear it. And so it can move in a sub community really, really, really quickly.
Nice. And if we're looking at, let's talk application. If you're going to build, you want your idea to move, even when resources are scarce, because you talk a lot about scarce resources and hitting resistance. How do I start?
So there's again, two routes probably. I don't have time to say, but the best route is, I think, is a living idea itself. Is to be able to say, okay, what is the message? What is the change? It could be like something direct. It could be an invitation. And one of the Gifted Reads, one of the applications of it is to actually build an invitation process. What is the, or I'll give an even practical example. So working with Caring Circles, which is a piece of software to help people help each other in times of need and coordinate that. Is there anything I could do for you, into something tangible and actionable? One of the things that's in that dynamic is to be able to harness the actual journey experience and really drill down to what's going on so that it can be carried into a place that it can then replicate out into other people, and people who come in to help somebody with something can then go, oh, this would actually really work well with the new baby, and then carry it forward. And it's a lot of the first step is actually to cut away all the noise and stop shouting and stop trying to figure out how to get the message out, and in fact turn inward and say, what is the journey that people need to take? What's the core? Who are the people that matter the most for it? And then how do I find them? And that's sort of the steps forward in that way.
And what about, what do leaders need to do to shift the context for it to take hold?
So with leadership specifically, one of the advantages of this is it's a two-way street. There's people who want to use this to say something, but there's also people who can use the same strategies to listen better and to engage, because it's about moving into conversation and dialogue and these trusted interactions. And I think sometimes leadership gets a bit of a bad rap as the sort of the expert standing on the podium telling everybody what's what. But it actually moves much more authentically in these kinds of conversations where you have actual conversation and people bringing their own part of the journey forward. And I think that with leadership, the challenge is that often the scaling doesn't allow that. And so the question becomes how better to do that strategically so that the best value both up and down, or sideways is actually for hard for it to view it, but takes hold and works.
Do you ever see leaders not being one of those central nodes? Like, is there really interesting data that comes out of networks that they're like, oh, I didn't, had no idea?
Yes and no. So yes, often actually leaders, you see this in, especially in partnerships. You'll have one person who lights up the central node in all the ways that you would look, and then you have another person whose connection is to three people. But those three people are those critically placed people, and that's that good old eigenvector centrality again. And there are actually people who, partly because of personality, partly because of role or responsibility. It was one of my favorite studies saw that it was the photocopy guy going from in a remote distributed business, going from place to place to place, that was having this huge influence because he was talking to all of the admin assistants every day, and he was the only one who was making this kind of migration and movement. So sometimes leadership is in a funny place, but leaders aren't always. In fact, I would say sometimes aren't often the people who are sitting in the highest value, although some of the other centrality values, there's four that I talk about in the book, really pick it up, and you can start to see how they fit into the picture.
Yeah, I can't remember what I was reading about. Who talks to the most people can be the people often that are outward facing, sales and or procurement, or the people that talk to everybody. And so keeping your eye on the people you wouldn't necessarily see as those amplifiers is that
Payroll
part of it as
clerks is a
well.
good example of one that just would never, they're often a very low paid role in the company, but they actually communicate with everybody around their payroll issues and can be a huge culture effector. And yeah, the dynamics really picked that up.
I was going to ask you, because we can, start to wrap it up anyway.
Sure.
I think we've got a lot out of it, and I hope people go and pick up your book. But what advice would you give to somebody that feels stuck, with a powerful idea but no idea of moving it forward? What's that first piece of advice you'd give them?
So I think as far as that, so I would start with not getting discouraged. I mean, the work that I do often brings me into people in alignment with this who are trying to do really incredible things against really incredible odds. And what one of the biggest lessons of my work and what prompted me to write the book in the first place and try to get this out to a broader group of people is that it doesn't have to stop. It doesn't have to not be that. It doesn't have to be that way. It can be very, very good. So the first is just some hope. I think the second part is there's a lot of power in what we do when we're incredibly intentional about it. And understanding what to do takes a bit of time and focus and energy, but it's actually far more powerful than we give it weight for. And we're so connected as people. We've seen examples where you could have a group of people in a room saying a vase is blue and someone else says it's red, and by the end of the night they will not only say it's blue, they will actually see it as blue, as tested with plugging into stuff in the mind and stuff. We're just social, and so being able to work with that authentically and honestly, which is the heartbeat of so many of the people that you're talking about, is actually a big strength. And that credibility and the trust that they bring into the world then flows guided in a way that really can propel their message. So I think there's a route for it. I would say beyond that, there's a great book out there that just got written that I'm very, very proud of having written about it. And I put in the book, I put also contacted my LinkedIn. I think most people are LinkedIn connected here. I'm happy to talk. I have a Calendly that can be grabbed. I'm happy to talk out some of these challenges with people too, because a little bit goes a long way.
You are an incredibly generous person with your time too, and time is one of those precious things. So it's always lovely that you have time for people. What's your hope for the book? Like other than it, what would you love to see?
I would love. Well, I have a private one and a public one. I guess the private or personal hope for me is there's a little bit of just being able to take the load of when I'm working with somebody off to help them sort of come up to speed. Because from the journey that we went through, which is pre-book, like you said, there was a few conversations you're like, slow down, back up, let's go through this again, right? And I think the book can cover off a lot of that dynamic. So that's just sort of a personal thing for me. But I think the big hope for the book is that it can come into the hands of people who are trying to make a difference and are feeling right now, especially like all the ground is moving and there's no way forward and it's all just sort of not possible, and to be able to resource them with the tools to be able to do what they're doing at a scale that they can't possibly reach otherwise. And I think that it's very much there. So that's my hope for the book, is that
Nice.
it already has started, which has been really gratifying because it hasn't been out for very long. But I hope that continues and grows.
That's nice. And it really is an ode to people. The start of the book is really lovely. Like it's a really, really nice, lovely start. Like it makes you sit up because you're talking to, really talking to the person. So, start by just reading that first chapter. then it's easy going.
You'll be like, this is not for me, or yes, this is speaking to something that's important. And I think you're right. Yeah.
You really talk to, and if it resonates for you, you won't put it down. So just start there. And once again, I'll put this gift code into the chat afterwards, but so that you can click on it. It's easier than writing down the code here. But Graham, thanks for joining us and helping us all think more deeply about how change actually spreads. You have been such an influence on what we're doing at our platform. We really want to help organizations understand, good decisions through the right mix of people. So, there's a lot of what we do that works quite well together. And I think that's what makes it feel so alive and relevant to your work. So everybody who's joined us, thank you. And we're going to put in, we've got one more comment left. Oh, yes, share that. Yes, I will share. We just got asked by Shannon to share that link, which we will do. But thanks for joining us. And
thanks so much for hosting.
And Graham will put his LinkedIn in the messages as well. But sure. Thank you all. And I really hope you get as much out of Graham's book as we do as an organization.